But right now it's an interesting time. You got two extremes, right? You got the left. They believe that the worst thing anybody can be or anybody can be called is a racist. And then you have the right, and they think that the worst thing anybody can be called right now is a cultural Marxist, right? If you're a cultural Marxist, completely, we're just dismissing you, you're a cultural Marxist. Now, thankfully, I've been called both within the last week. So if you're looking for a video that's going to polarize, if you're looking for a video that's going to pin an us versus them mentality, and you lean very strong to one side or the other, you're not going to like me or this video very much. But if you're looking for the nuance, if you're looking for some common ground, hopefully we can have here, I think you will appreciate it. Bring it all back. Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro on the current state of race in America. It's in this video. We kind of, there's some points that he makes that hopefully we can agree with. Hopefully we can disagree with. So let's just open it up.
Actually reading one of the best-selling books in the country, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility.
Okay, so there's a book, White Fragility. Some of you guys have maybe heard of it. And I also put up a tweet that said, if you can believe in systemic racism and also not view critical race theory or intersectionality as gospel truth. Just Google it, but white fragility kind of follows some of the same thing. Now, it's not to say that there isn't truths in them and there aren't some good ideas in them, but I said you can see both. You can see systemic racism, structural racism, and you could also see these other things over here and not view them as gospel truth. So here Ben opens up with just going in on her book, White Fragility.
Let me just tell you, a greater pile of horseshit has never been produced by a bevy of horses. It is.
Okay, so a greater, and there's going to be profanity on this video, by the way. Hide your kids, hide your wife. I'm not editing their interview.
Basically rooted in the same theory as Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. The basic definition of racism changes in this theory. So racism, you and I were sitting here discussing racism, and the way I define racism is probably the same way you define racism. You believe in the inferiority or superiority of a group based on race, of an individual based on their membership in that group too, right? That would be race.
Now, that is a traditional definition of racism. You view one group as inferior or superior. And now, when I started going to college, the definition did shift a little bit. I'll be honest. All of a sudden, it was power and prejudice. And when I Googled the definition for racism, it was specifically about a minority group, right? So I don't really have I don't have a horse in the race on whether or not Black people can or can't be racist, whether or not racism is only systemic and only when there's power. I don't really care, but I think he does make an interesting point that the definition definitely shifted, but maybe that's because the power dynamic has shifted. I don't know, maybe because racism became more and more covert as time went on. And I think regardless on what it is, clearly non-white people or Black people or Mexican people or Asian people can be hateful and prejudiced towards other people, whether we label it as racism. Again, is this like, why is this thing like, the worst thing you could ever be as a racist? No, being hateful, the sin of partiality, it's all wrong. It's all bad. But racism can be viewed as like a power dynamic, a systemic thing. I'm going to call it for what it is. That's why I did a video on Nick Cannon when he said some wild stuff. And I'm going to call it the way I see it. I'm not going to be partial with, calling out wrong ideas, period. Not to attack people, but to attack ideas. So I think they open up with this idea. This is an interesting point. Let's go back to it.
Racism. I believe that you're inferior or you're superior based on your race. End of story, right? That's racism.
That's racist.
So Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi redefine racism to mean any societal structure that results in a racial inequality is itself racist. So any structure that results in a not exact proportion between whites and blacks.
Does that make the NBA racist?
Exactly. The answer is kind of yes, except that
racist?
the NBA is not racist because obviously it benefits Black people, right? I mean, now, the NBA is not racist except it's because it's a meritocracy is the reason the NBA is not racist.
Right.
But Robin DiAngelo and Kendi both suggest that meritocracy is an aspect of whiteness. They say that meritocracy and individual are aspects of whiteness because these institutions, things like meritocracy and individualism and not seeing people's colors, these just reinforce hierarchies that end with disparate outcomes.
I am 100% for equal opportunity. I think people should have equal opportunity. What he's saying here is that the logical conclusion is that it's not just about equal opportunities, it's about equal outcomes. And any system that doesn't have equal outcomes is then inherently racist, right? Systemic racism. Even the idea of meritocracy. What's a meritocracy? Meritocracy is when people advance based on their merit. The best person in the the best basketball player gets to the NBA. The best rapper goes platinum, right? Now we know that we don't live in a meritocracy. We know it's as much about who you know and the timing of what you do, and is there value for it in the marketplace, as well as your merit, your contribution. So we know that the idea of even of a meritocracy isn't necessarily absolutely true in our context. But I do think it's an important point, and I do think it's unfortunate that we would say the idea of a meritocracy, which I think we should all be for. I think the best person for the job should win. I think, right? I think it should be about who has the most talent, who has the most passion, who has the most work ethic, who's the best contributor to the job. I think they should win. I think with technology, we're getting closer and closer there. So I don't think that that's inherently bad. I don't think a meritocracy is bad, even though I would say, yeah, we don't live necessarily in a meritocracy because so much of how people become successful has to do with where they come from in their circles. So that's probably where I would disagree with some of the ideas of Dr. Angelo in terms of the white fragility thing. But
what they say is, in order to be anti-racist, you have to want to tear down the entire system. They literally say this. I'm not really. I know that I'm not misidentifying the argument.
This is where Marxism comes in. This is where the fight against racism, against the sin of partiality, which I would say there's contamination in some systems and some structures. He's saying that you have to tear down the entire system. When he says system, he's talking about capitalism, just so we're clear. He's talking about free market. He's talking about the bedrock of America. I come from a real socialist communist country. If you guys don't know, I was born in Azerbaijan, Baku. We were a part of the Soviet Union, not lit. Communism, not lit. Socialism, not lit, which I think is hilarious when people accuse me of being like a asymptomatic cultural Marxist, because I, think that there's truth in systemic racism and structural racism. But what he's saying is, hey, the reason why this is problematic, the reason why intersectionality, the reason why critical race theory, the reason why these ideas are problematic, because it ultimately is attempting to tear down the entire structure of what we have. Now, should we make changes? Should we make adjustments? Should we accommodate? Absolutely. But he's saying, listen, tearing this thing down is probably not the good idea, because even though America's not perfect, I do believe that it's still the best option out there worldwide. And again, I haven't been to New Zealand, I haven't been to Australia, but I'm talking about like traveling to Europe, traveling to Canada, being to Mexico, coming from a communist socialist nation. I do think that what we have here is the best current working model. Doesn't mean it's perfect. This is where you'll get the pushback of, hey, this isn't just about these incidences with police brutality. No. The logical conclusion of the Marxist ideology is we want to completely undo capitalism. What is capitalism? Just so we're clear, capitalism is private property rights. You buy a house, it's your house. It's not the state's house, and it's not if you accumulate so much wealth that they get to come and take your house and divvy it up. It's private property rights. It's the free market. It's the stock market. It's the freedom to be an entrepreneur. It's the freedom to choose where you live. It's the freedom to choose how you spend your money, right? Good. These are good ideas. I would argue that these are biblical ideas.
To be anti-racist, you have to tear down free markets, or you have to tear down free speech, or you have to, and what that means is,
and this is, again, I don't know if that's the basic notion. I think Ben read the book and only pulled out what he wanted to pull out, okay? Because white fragility has more to do with white people being very sensitive when addressed their covert racism. And so he pulled this out, and again, some of this is true from critical race theory and intersectionality. And he's saying, hey, listen, if the logical conclusion of being anti-racist is to dethrone and throw away capitalism, I don't like the idea. And this is what you're going to hear more and more of this stuff from the right, because it's not an attack on racism the way I would see it. It's an attack on the fabric of America, the values of America, right? It's deeper to people from Ben Shapiro's perspective.
Of course, that anytime there's rioting and looting, that's really just an expression of outrage at the broader American system.
Anytime there's rioting or looting, it's really an outrage of the broader American system. That sounds like radical left rhetoric, okay? That doesn't sound like most people I know who went and protested. Guys like my mate Trey Little, who was in Detroit telling suburban Antifa kids to not riot and not loot because the police officers there were black and were from his neighborhood. You guys could Google my interview with Trey Little or search for my interview with Trey Little. So I don't know how many, like, I don't know if everybody agrees with Ben here, or if everybody agrees with these ideas of intersection, like the conclusions of these ideas. Joe Rogan does a great job of correcting him. Check this out.
There clearly is some impact in the echoes of slavery, and then after that, Jim Crow. There's clearly some impact.
So I think this is how most of us would define structural racism, systemic racism. We would say, hey, the laws from 50 years ago still impact us today. Redlining impacts black families today. The war on drugs impacts black families today. Now, it doesn't matter if black people were for harsher sentences of other black people or whatever, because that's the kind of like the rebuttal. The point is, this stuff happened and it disproportionately affected poor people and black people. This is Joe Rogan's point, and I think he nails it. Let's
impact in these deeply impoverished communities that don't seem to advance.
Yes. So to make the argument about institutional racism, there's a couple ways you can read this. When people say systemic racism or institutional racism, I usually ask them to be a little more specific in what they mean, because there are a few ways you can read that. One is history has impact. Of course, that's true.
Yeah, we would all agree. History has impact. But let's not get it twisted, because there are a lot of my Caucasian brothers and sisters that won't even acknowledge that fact, that they literally think that, well, hey, Oprah made it. Why can't you make it, young man from the south side of Chicago? Hey, Barack Obama became, right? And this is a bigger concept of survivorship bias. I'm going to get to it, of survivorship bias, where you're looking at the most successful survivors and you're saying, well, so-and-so did it, you can do it.
History has impact. Of course that's true, right? That's true for everybody. It's true in your family history. But if you have a grandfather who went to prison on a particular charge, that leads to poverty for your parents, which led to more poverty for you, right? People have histories. Those histories are embedded in their life experiences, and that's true for societies as well. All of that is first. Then there's the question as to whether the institutions today are racist. And that's not quite the same thing, right? Because history has consequences is not the same thing as saying the rules today are racist. Because the rules...
Now, this is a good point. Are the rules today racist? And I would say, actually, I'm not going to tell you what I would say. Let's just keep watching.
The rules today are not racist, actually. The rules today are quite not racist.
He thinks the rules are not racist.
But historically, it's fairly recent. If you go from the civil rights movement to 2020, we're really not talking about that much time.
We're talking 3 generations.
50 plus years.
60 years, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
50 plus.
Right,
in the world of, you know,
in the vast span of human history, it's not
a very small amount of time.
Right.
So clearly there's some impact of both racism and then Jim Crow laws. So that's where I'm...
And granted, maybe you come from a very great environment and you don't know anybody that was radically impacted, families impacted by the war on drugs, right? And I could talk about a specifically racist, biased law, okay? The crack and coke disparity in sentencing, 100 to 1. Okay, Google that. This is in the 80s, and again, the pushback from the right is going to be, well, there were a lot of black Christians and black pastors and black people that wanted that law, right? And it's like, yeah, it doesn't mean that it was okay. Like, it doesn't make it right. This is the 80s, guys. Again, Google the crack disparity law. Google the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. This didn't get corrected until 2010. That's 10 years ago, fam. What are we talking about?
Saying there's a middle ground.
Yeah, and it is important for people on my side of the aisle, conservatives, to acknowledge and recognize the importance of...
Thank you, Ben.
...of history in people's living situations now. And it's important for people on the other side of the aisle to, at the same time, not attribute every single thing to history. Because
but
people
isn't
who are
there
born...
always something like that? There's always, like, extremes on each position, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but I don't think that it lies as far in the dead center of that as people, I think, want it to.
If there were things like the Homestead Act, which, what did the Homestead Act do? Gave white people free property. If there were injustices like black soldiers not getting the GI Bill, not getting the 40 acres and a mule, okay, redlining, if there were things done to intentionally remove wealth and disrupt the accumulation of wealth in specific communities, that does impact us. And the most recent thing is I could point to, and then, by the way, they say that there was some degree of redlining as late as the 80s in Atlanta. I can't dispute that or prove that. That's just one of the things in the systemic racism argument. However, Alabama didn't didn't lift their ban on interracial marriage until the year 2000. I just gave you 2, Mr. Racism Doesn't Exist. 2 racist laws, okay, within our lifetime, within my lifetime. I was in high school in the year 2000. Okay, 2010 was 10 years ago. That's when the coke versus crack disparity was lifted. Okay, again, these things don't happen in a vacuum. Let's not ignore that. Now watch this. This is a very interesting shift here, where Ben kind of starts talking about the oppression of his own people. And Jewish people have had oppression. I'm Armenian. Armenian people have had oppression. We don't need to get in a pissing match about whose oppression is worse. I think that's counterintuitive. But let's check out his point.
The way those get alleviated is people making better choices over time. Right? That is the problem. That's the way that those issues get alleviated. When Jews arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, to talk of my people, when they came, they were impoverished. They didn't speak the language. They were banned from country.
So he goes, hey, when Jews arrived, they didn't do good. Okay, cool, fair enough. Now watch this. Right, this is, again, you got to appreciate Joe Rogan on this.
Clubs. There was open discrimination against them. They were banned from Harvard. Right, Harvard Law School had quotas on Jews. The way to fight against that is to make good decisions, and so you fight against the system to make sure that the system has...
Listen, I don't know anybody that's like, yeah, make bad decisions. That's how you fight racism. Maybe like really wild people believe that. But the notion that everything could just be fixed by telling people to make good decisions, I think is just shallow. I think it's just very shallow, and it's very superficial, and it doesn't really dig beneath the surface. But I appreciate Joe Rogan here. Watch.
You clearly see that there's a big difference between people coming over here willingly and doing so in order to better their lives versus someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property.
Well,
and
bingo! Difference, Ben Shapiro, between immigrants, usually the brightest and the smartest, coming over here versus a group of people who what? Who were brought here as slaves, okay? And not just slaves, because there's been, slavery has been throughout history, but specifically chattel slaves. Different type of slavery, guys, okay? Google that, do your own research. There's a difference. There's clearly a difference. And then that specific group has had racist law, racist system over and over. So let's keep going.
Then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history and red line laws and all the other things that were put in place to sort of keep them in very specific areas, which to this...
Okay, again, redline. What is redlining? Redlining is keeping certain people out of neighborhoods, keeping certain people from buying properties in neighborhoods that will appreciate. There's also white flight, which an area like Compton was predominantly a white neighborhood, and then as soon as black people who broke into the middle class, despite the odds, broke into the middle class in the late 60s and 70s, moved out west, all of a sudden the white families left, which then what? Took a lot of the jobs out, created some created lack of economic opportunity.
They remain crime-ridden, gang-ridden, deeply impoverished communities.
Well, that's true, but the question is how much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody?
But how much of that 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is based on him growing up in this fucked up environment where that's what he models, where everything around him is crime and gangs, and you imitate your atmosphere, which is what all humans do.
Right, but the answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community and you're not one of those 18-year-old kids that grows up with the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see, and that's all you know.
So I think Joe Rogan nails it here. I've been to the south side of Chicago. I've been to Baltimore. I've been to Philly. I've done shows in a lot of these areas, right? And to assume that it all could just be fixed by telling people like, hey, just don't shoot each other, right? And what Joe Rogan is saying, listen, this is multi-generations of fatherlessness. Why? Because of the war on drugs, right? There's multi-generations. And Ben Shapiro makes some counterpoints here I'll get to in a second. But this is years and years. And environment is so powerful. Now, I didn't grow up in the south side of Chicago. I grew up in San Diego. And I can tell from my own story. Listen, I was 11 years old, and based on my environment, I was breaking into houses. I was smoking weed. My entire block got worse and worse. This is San Diego in the 90s. And I was down a very dark trajectory, like arrested at 11, on probation, being a knucklehead, breaking into houses, in a gang, all these different things. And same thing, my father wasn't in my life at the time. My mother and my dad split. And thankfully, my mother saw these things and had the economic foresight to get a better job and to move us to North County, San Diego. And I found my solitude in basketball, and I found my solitude in sport. So to diminish how influential it is, the environment of somebody, is really short-sighted. And yes, my guys, San Diego in the 90s was rough. And I'm not saying that I was no big tough guy. I was a confused kid without a father. That's who I was. So I was running around brandishing weapons and all this kind of stuff.
The only way that's going to be the thing that your kid doesn't know is for you not to do it. At some point, personal agency has to come in.
It does.
Because
but education, and teaching them about personal agency and letting.
Yeah, Ben thinks that the entire world has access. Conservatives have good ideas, personal responsibility, private property rights, capitalism, invest in the market. A lot of these are good ideas. I love Dave Ramsey. I love conservative ideas. I think they have a lot of the right solutions, but they gloss over and assume that everybody knows that, yeah, stupid, just stop shooting each other. Like dog, what? Come on. Like, you can't think that people are that, have that much access. And I don't mean access in the sense, yes, we have access on our phone, and I do think technology is changing a lot of this kind of stuff, but you can't assume that everybody has access to good information, good inspiration, and more importantly, a system and an example of how to make it out.
Them understand that there's a way out of this, and that the path that they see being replicated over and over again by these people that wind up dying young, that wind up going to jail, that there are other options. There's a lot of kids that never get that other information, or if they get it, they get little blips of it, but the vast majority of the information, the vast majority of the influence they get is terrible.
Well, I totally agree with this, and this is why I think the worst thing that you can say to a kid is you're born behind the 8 ball, and no matter what you do, you're not going to succeed.
Yes.
Right?
And they're both right. That is something really terrible that you could see. That is. Don't tell people that, hey, you're just never going to get ahead because the system. I did a whole video on this. I did multiple videos on this. This is why I don't like conspiracy theories. I did multiple videos about this stuff. My reaction to the Out of the Darkness documentary, my whole video on conspiracy. I explain why I think that low opportunity, low high crime areas mixed with conspiracy theories is a horrible recipe. And then you add like intersectionality and all these concepts being presented as truth. Yes, it's not helpful. I agree with him.
That's literally the worst thing you can say to a kid. What you should be saying is, look at how your grandfather was born behind the 8 ball, and look how hard he had to work in order to get ahead. And look at all the opportunities.
That's true, though. But if your grandfather wasn't ahead, didn't get ahead, if your grandfather was in and out of jail, if your father was in and out of jail, everyone around.
You could tell, like, Ben doesn't know people like this in real life. Like he's, like, I know people that, like, multi-generations of mass incarceration, like in and out of the revolving door. I personally got friends and family in my life like this. He doesn't know anybody like this, so he thinks everybody is just choosing to be an idiot and wild out. Doesn't understand that people who grow up in poverty are more likely to experience trauma. That trauma positions you more likely to recreate the trauma, right? That you're more likely to experience poverty so you got poverty that causes a lot of trauma, a lot of abuse, which then causes more poverty, right? Like, he's just like, no, man, just fix it. Just stop. What? Come on.
Around you is like that. If there's literally no influence that's positive in your life, the idea of saying to a kid like that, hey, don't pick up a gun and shoot somebody, that's way too simplistic a version of their future, in my
Well, I mean, the problem is I don't see an alternative solution. Right? When you're talking about solutions.
I think an alternative solution is there has to be some sort of large-scale intervention in these communities to do something about what has already been set in motion and the momentum that keeps continuing decade after decade. I don't know what could be done.
Well, but that's the problem, is that I think that a lot of the solutions.
And I like Joe saying, listen, I don't know what the solution is, and I don't have all the solutions, and I don't think it's an either or. I'm definitely not for the dismantlement of capitalism and the nuclear family and a lot of the stuff that's going to get attached to some of these views, right? it could get a slippery slope either way, right? One side is we'll just burn the whole system and America's all bad always, right? And then the other side is like, hey, you know, we just need to tell people to take responsibility, right? Just take responsibility. Mind you, they're in an area where there are no jobs. There isn't a lot of economic opportunity. The education system's trash, and you just want them to take responsibility. Okay, great. Glad we solved that. Glad it's right. And you see how both sides can then feel like they're gaslighting each other, right? You tell somebody that comes from an impoverished area without a ton of economic opportunity, again, have you been to the south side of Chicago? Have you been to Baltimore? Have you been to Philadelphia, right? Have you been to San Bernardino? Have you been to these areas? You tell somebody that comes from an area like that, just listen to Gary Vee and go do it, bro. Like, okay, you got to show them how, right? And Joe Rogan says this is why it's important for people who make it out to come back and show people how, right? And so, yes, everyone does have cell phones, but you still need to see an example. My biggest advantages has been me having access early on in my career, after I, got saved and found Jesus and all that kind of stuff, having access to other Christians who were full-time musicians and being able to pick their brain and look at their blueprint and watch Lecrae in 2009, 2010, watch Reach Records, how they set up 116, how they built that movement, being able to pay attention and not just see them off in a distance or see them on my phone, but to get up close and personal and to listen and to watch it in real time. That is a way bigger advantage than just assume that because somebody has a smartphone that they could watch Gary Vee and boom, all their problems are solved. So gaslighting on one side is you're telling people they're making it up. That's really how this view comes off, is you're telling people who see the gap, the wealth disproportion. And the issue becomes is, listen, you're telling one side that you're making it up and you're gaslighting it, right? And anybody that supports this side is a cultural Marxist. So now you're boogeymanning me and telling me I'm a cultural Marxist. The other side is saying, hey, listen, the slippery slope is the more we go down this rabbit hole, we're going to keep dismantling the family. We're going to keep having more single parent household. We're going to keep having more fatherless households because some of the other views attached over here aren't very helpful. And what you really got to do is you got to, again, what are the 3 things I said that guarantee you 98% of the time to break into the middle class, according to a study done by the Brooks Institute? You have to graduate high school. It's huge. You have to get a full-time job, and you have to wait until you're at least 21 to get married, then have kids, right? And so that is true. These things these don't have to be opposing, polarizing ideas where you got to buy in all or nothing. These things are both true. And really, it's this idea, I think, of survivorship bias. Okay, survivorship bias. I want you guys to look up this phrase when you get a chance. Survivorship bias. In World War II, they were studying airplanes that were coming back that were shot up. And these airplanes were coming back shot up. And they were trying to figure out where should they reinforce armor. And they kept looking and saying, oh, well, the bullet holes are here. And they were studying where the bullet holes are. They were primarily on the wings, towards the back of the plane. And they were saying, hey, we need to reinforce these areas because these areas are getting shot up, right? And then a mathematician said, no. You're looking at planes that came back. And you're thinking of what areas to reinforce on planes that came back. We should be trying to figure out what took the planes down. It was when they got shot in the cockpit. It was when they got shot, right? And they're saying our brains naturally look at the survivors. We naturally look at the survivors and we assume that because Oprah did it from Chicago, then everybody can do it. We assume that because Barack Obama became president, that everybody can do it. We're not looking at all the airplanes that got taken down because they were shot. We're looking at only the survivors, and we're assuming that the survivors are the ones who get to speak on behalf of everybody, not understanding that that's still a minority. I'll give you some other examples for this survivorship bias, and I think this applies. You're not looking at every single person who was a victim to the war on drugs, was a victim to gang violence, right? Nobody gets paid to do speeches about how they became a failure and how their life didn't reach its full potential. People get paid to do speeches about how they overcame the odds. And we think that becomes the standard. If somebody can overcome the odds and the fact that maybe they had God in their life, maybe they got lucky, maybe there was timing, maybe they had access to information, access to mentors, access to capital, we think that anybody can do it. And so I literally have had people tell me, how can black people complain? Look at Oprah. Like the answer to structural racism can't be look at Oprah and Barack. It has to be deeper than that. And this is where this goofy survivorship bias comes into play with the issue of race. And I think it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate because we're not actually looking at the hundreds of thousands of people that don't make it and what were their circumstances and what neighborhoods did they come from and what were their situations like and how many people did go to jail. Again, I have people in my life that have been in and out of jail. It's not because they just were dumb people and just wanted to do bad stuff. Right? It's a holistic environmental thing. Most of them are dealing with trauma. Most of them were molested as kids or saw some kind of violent, traumatic event happen when they were as kids. So we have to look below the surface and say, okay, how do we address these things? And again, I'm going to always point back to scripture. And you guys, some of you guys may not like that, and that's cool. But when you're dealing with people who are coming from a different circumstance than you, don't assume to just have all the answers, because you don't. You don't know what you're talking about. Unless you come from these environments, you don't know what you're talking about. And if you do come from these environments, then listen, I don't care if you want to be a black Republican or conservative. I am not speaking on behalf of black people, just so we're clear. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. This is my opinion, okay? But let's look at this verse on chapter 4, verse 19. We loved because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command. Anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. Brother and sister in the Lord, brother and sister does not necessarily mean of the same household. That Jesus loved us first, and therefore we are supposed to love others of the house of faith, of people who identify as Christians, which come from all nations and all tribes and all socioeconomic statuses and all races and all neighborhoods and all degrees of poverty. We are to love those. And so I've said this before, bad fruit, bad root. If your ideology is forcing you to be dismissive of people's trauma, of people's issues, of communities' issues, if your ideology is forcing you to have a hardened heart towards people who are different than you, and this goes both ways, then I would say the fruit of that is rooted in a bad root. You're called to love people. You're called to love your neighbor as yourself. If you're a Christian, if you're not a Christian, ignore what I'm talking about, okay? You know what I'm talking about. But if your response to every time a systemic issue is brought up, and again, I use the word systemic very loosely. I don't think America needs to be thrown away and we need to start all over and be socialist. But we have to first start with love and empathy. And sometimes love and empathy is just listening, acknowledging. And then, yes, once you've listened and acknowledged and you've established a degree of credibility and a degree of empathy, then maybe you can go in for the hard truth. And in this degree, in this area, the hard truth is that we do need to take ownership for our actions, that we do all need to take personal responsibility, regardless of what environment we come from, regardless of the strikes against us, regardless on whether we had our father in our life or I didn't. We do. But that doesn't mean that you just dismiss people who maybe don't have that yet. Maybe they haven't understood. Maybe they haven't connected all the dots that, poverty and fatherlessness and having kids out of wedlock and doing whatever feels good, that's gonna make me stay in poverty, which is probably gonna make me more likely to commit crime, which is gonna make me more likely to go. Not everybody has that revelation. We have to be patient with people, man. If your ideology or your political spectrum isn't causing you to love people you disagree with, then perhaps you need to reevaluate what you believe in and why you believe in that. So, what is the conclusion here? Ladies and gentlemen, we got to love each other better. We got to listen to each other better. And that doesn't mean I'm going to water down the truth. The truth is we all need Jesus. The truth is a changed heart is going to make your behavior act accordingly, right? That is the truth. However, I don't expect spiritually dead people to act like they're alive. I don't expect people who don't know Jesus to act like they know Jesus. I expect spiritually dead people to act like spiritually dead people. And I pray that God would enlighten them. And I don't want them to be poor. I don't want them to be victims of gang violence or police brutality, right? But when you're looking at these things, and again, watch the full video. There's a lot of good stuff in here. I want you guys to go watch it. There's a lot of good stuff in here on both sides of the argument. And I think Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro are both right. But we can't let survivorship bias drive our view of people we disagree with. And we definitely can't let a hardened heart say, hey, they just need to get it together, fix it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's just not how it works, man. Thank you guys for watching. Hey, listen, I'm not perfect. I don't got all the answers. These are just my ideas. If you disagree with me, cool. Make a video. Respond. Show your face. Let me know. I'm open to being proven wrong, but I believe both of these guys are right, and I believe we have to lead with love. And if you didn't see my entire video, again, for the 90th time, this is not an endorsement of cultural Marxism or socialism. I am neither. I don't identify as either or, but I do identify as a follower of Jesus who said that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. If you're not a follower of Jesus, then we don't even have to talk. But I'm speaking to Christians and encouraging and empowering them to love people. Start with love, start with empathy. If we start there, that's going to give us the credibility to speak truth and empower people. Thank you guys.